I think that's it for our updates. So I will quickly move here to introduce Dr. Rebecca Flitcroft. We all call her Becky. She's a research fish biologist with the U.S. Forest Service and Pacific Northwest Research Station here in Oregon. And she's the co-chair of the Freshwater Specialist Group with the Wild Commission on Protected Areas. She received her doctorate in fisheries science and master's of science in natural resource geography from Oregon State, and completed her undergrad and bachelor of science in environmental science and economics at Willamette University. Her research focus is Pacific salmonids, multi-scale aquatic ecosystem assessments over time, effects of disturbance on aquatic ecosystems and native biota, and community-based conservation planning and aquatic biodiversity. Local connection here with Rebecca. I know she's used some data that Midcoast has produced in our rapid bioassessment in the early, I think there's a set of late 90s and some early 2000 data that we had worked with contractors to pretty much snorkel all the Midcoast streams and get some really good info on where salmon use was high. And I know she's worked that into some of her research, and that's gold for us. If we're producing data that's being used like that, that's great, and it really helps the research community and helps us get more funding to get more of those kind of studies on the ground too. So I will stop there. I will stop my screen share and give the floor. Thank you, Becky.
Well, hi, everybody. I'm getting my screen up here and switch it around. All right, can you see my screen all right? Great. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. And the data set that you're talking about, that continuous snorkel surveys with continuous snorkel surveys over time, is still an incredible data set and a really novel data set to be able to use. And I just had somebody email me today asking about that data set. So I'm not the only one who has been interested in that piece of work. So anyway, thank you. And thank you for the invitation to be here. For those of you who may have heard this presentation or something very similar about 6 years ago, I gave a very similar talk to this one then. So this is really just an overview of Pacific salmon characteristics, life history, some of the things that we are anticipating with climate change, and what that really means for coastal systems. And I'm going to focus particularly on estuaries and lowland systems in this presentation. So talking about winners and losers, climate and Pacific salmon in coastal Oregon. So I like to start with this slide because I don't know that how many people realize how many of our Pacific salmon we do have in Oregon. And I have added and steelhead because a lot of people think steelhead are salmon. So when I don't include them on here, I have people ask me, what about steelhead? And then I have to say, well, they're a trout. But I thought I would put them on here anyway. So of these Pacific salmon species and our steelhead, we have all but Masu somewhere in Oregon. So we have quite a broad a representation of Pacific salmon on the Oregon coast. And if we look at the distribution of Pacific salmon broadly, here we are in Oregon in the southern portion of their distribution. I think of us as being on the East Coast for Pacific salmon because they're distributed all around the Pacific. So west coast of the US, but East Coast for the distribution of our Pacific salmon. And it's important to recognize that we are in that more southern distribution of Pacific salmon. And it's interesting for a couple of reasons that we'll talk about in a little bit. So typical anadromous salmon life history. So we have adults return to fresh water to spawn, eggs stay in the gravel a varying amount of time. Juveniles stay in fresh water a varying amount of time. We have, Coho can stay in fresh water for up to 2 years in Alaska. They're just in fresh water for a year down here. And then out to the ocean via the estuary. Again, estuary for varying amounts of time. Fish maturing in the ocean. I've got 1 to 2 years on this figure, but it can certainly be longer, particularly for Chinook, before they return to those spawning grounds and die. A difference between anadromous salmonids and our sea run trout is that our sea run trout don't necessarily die after they spawn. They can go back out to the ocean, they can return again and spawn again. So that's a difference between our salmon and trout. So for our Pacific salmon, where do they spend their time in their life history? So this is from a paper that we published a few years ago, looking across life histories of Pacific salmon, all of them, of course, needing freshwater, estuaries, and marine environments in order to successfully complete their life cycle. And for many of our species of Pacific salmon, the majority of their life is spent in the marine environment. Some people think of these as being marine fishes that have a freshwater tendency. I like to think of them as freshwater fishes that have a marine tendency, but nobody really knows the difference there or where all of that came from. So varying amounts of time in all of these environments, making habitats and connectivity between habitats in all of these environments critical for completion of life history. Now, it's also really interesting, Pacific salmon are ancient. So our youngest Pacific salmon on the block, when we look at age of these fishes, are sockeye, and they're 6 million years old. That was when we estimate they differentiated from the rest of the population then of Pacific salmon. So our oldest species of Pacific salmon, Coho, differentiated from Atlantic salmon about 15 to 20 million years ago. So these fishes have been around for a very, very long time. And over this long time, they have accumulated a wide variety of adaptations to survive in a very dynamic world and landscape. And those adaptations are some of the things I want to talk about in a little bit. It's also interesting to note that Pacific salmon in Oregon and Washington actually haven't been here in the latest round for that long. So they moved down here and started occupying habitats and distributing through habitats down here in Oregon and Washington and Northern California with the retreat of those continental glaciers that allowed that southern migration into our area. And along with that opening of habitat that came from the retreat of the continental glaciers, there were also really important disturbance processes and events that affected these early colonizing Pacific salmon. One of them were those massive floods coming out of Lake Missoula. So as the continental ice sheets retreated, they would create this ice dam there in eastern Idaho. And every few hundred years or so, that dam would break, and that glacial Lake Missoula would drain, and it would scour eastern Washington and scoured the Columbia River Gorge. And then it would back up all those sediments in the Willamette Valley. And that's where so much of the sediment and topsoil that we have in the Willamette Valley is courtesy of eastern Washington. But if you think about salmon and the fish that were in the streams undergoing these incredible disturbance events, they still survived and persisted. And that is a reflection of some of the adaptations that these fishes have that we're going to talk about in a little bit. They've also experienced other things that we are thinking about now that are potentially important for understanding resilience to climate adaptation. And one of those is sea level rise. So this is a map of the Columbia here in Oregon and Washington. And you can see that the coastline was pretty far to the west, farther than it is today, because sea level was lower, a few thousand years ago. And as those ice sheets melted, we've had sea level rising fairly gradually over thousands of years. So our fish in our area have lived through and survived just major disturbance processes and sea level rise when it was a very slow process on the Oregon coast. So if we think about how dynamic landscapes are around the Pacific Rim, we have huge disturbance processes like volcanic eruptions that occur on the order of thousands and thousands of years. We have gradual sea level rise occurring slowly over thousands of years. Over shorter time steps, we have landslides, we have wildfires that occur on the tens to hundreds of year time scale. So these types of naturally occurring disturbance processes and events are things that our native salmon have been living with for millions of years, right? So this is something that they have managed to figure out how to survive. Along comes people, and we have introduced chronic or permanent disturbance events like dams, things that block movement and passage in systems and that don't necessarily have a recovery time associated with them. So anthropogenic disturbances are quite different from the types of disturbances that our native fish evolved to be able to be resilient to over time. And some of those strategies I've been talking about, oh, they've got all these great adaptations to survive disturbances, and these are a few of them. So one of the biggest ones is that they bet hedge, right? They're the biggest gamblers out there. They know that on some level, some of these streams are likely to experience a debris flow, or some of these watersheds are going to have a wildfire. And so the populations are distributed in such a way that some portion of the population is likely going to be able to survive. And that portion of the population that does survive is able to take advantage of new habitats. It's also useful to remember that a huge part of the population of our fishes is out in the marine environment. So when we have disturbances, they affect usually those rearing juveniles in the stream, but the majority of the population is out at sea. So as those adults return to repopulate the streams and to use those habitats, adults don't always return to their natal streams. There's really interesting research, particularly done around Vancouver Island, that shows that fishes that are returning to sites that have been more disturbed, particularly from timber harvest or other types of activities, are less likely to spawn there. They're more likely to stray and spawn somewhere else. So again, those adults will move around and take advantage of newly opened habitats and avoiding those that may not provide better habitat for rearing juveniles. We see that juveniles use a wide variety of habitats. So many of our Pacific salmon aren't as specialized in their habitat needs as we see with some other fishes. So they can use a variety of different types of habitats, and they need different habitats seasonally throughout the course of the year, and so have to move around to find them. We see different distributions of Pacific salmon depending on where you are in the river system, and I'll show a slide that demonstrates that in a minute. And then we have these behavioral differences. We have some aggressive juveniles that defend territories. You see that particularly with Coho. You have others that are less aggressive, that move around or move out of different environments. So we have this huge amount of adaptation to be able to have some portion of the population be able to move and take advantage of habitats that open. And we don't have all of the population in one place. So this is that pre-human modification of the system type of setting that we have for our Pacific salmon that has allowed them to be profoundly successful over the millennia. So I said that different fishes use different parts of the system. So we often find our trout in headwater areas. So our steelhead and our cutthroat, where gradients are higher and streams are smaller. Moving downstream, we'll find our coho. And then down farther, we'll find our chinook. So we have these salmon that are, adapted to be more effective in different parts of the river system, and have that sort of differentiation as they use the river system. So when we think about habitat and impacts and recovery and restoration, there's different fishes are going to be affected by those actions, and depending on where you are in the system. And then there's the estuary. So the estuary life history is a really important one for us to understand. And it's a newer part of our understanding of the life history diversity that is inherent in our salmonids. There's been some interesting, innovative work that was done in the 70s looking at chinook. And so there was an understanding that chinook really had a need to use estuaries and do a lot of rearing estuaries And there was a dearth of research on this topic for a long time until a couple of decades ago, we saw some very interesting work being done in some of our coastal systems demonstrating how important estuaries are for life history diversity for Coho as well as for Chinook. So when we look at that data, it isn't just that the successful fishes are moving into the estuary, staying there for a short period of time as they physiologically adjust to being able to process salt water instead of fresh water, which is that shift in osmoregulation. But we have fish that come in and will stay in the estuary for up to a year. And we have fish that come in and then move out and then come back in again. And all of this is more demonstration of that bet hedging behavioral and environmental variability that we see that our native fishes, our native salmon have that are embedded in them, so that some portion of the population will always be surviving. And, you know, there's more to this story than we have some individuals that move into the estuaries and spend a little time and move out. This work, which was done by Wainwright and Giannico, published in 2016, this was down on the Coos system. And they did a really nice job in this study of looking at how juvenile Coho in particular were moving around. So the juvenile Coho in this blue circle that I have here were the one that they compared the survival rates in the wintertime of those juveniles that stayed in one place and didn't move, or the ones that moved down into the estuary and then maybe moved back into the river. And those that moved around had a significantly higher survival rate than the fish that didn't move around. And that resilience associated with using the estuary was not demonstrated in the upper portion of the system, where those fish that moved didn't necessarily have access to the estuary. It's been a long-held belief, really, in fisheries that the fish that might move out of fresh water, that are moving downstream, are somehow maladaptive, that they are not going to survive well. And this kind of research really throws that story on its head. And another way that we can look at how juveniles are using estuaries is through otoliths. So these are the ear bone of fishes. And so we can collect the ear bones during spawning surveys. And you can see how small the otolith is. It's in that person's hand there, those tiny little ear bones. And when we zoom in on the otolith, it's like rings on a tree, right? Over time, those rings are laid down. And when you analyze the chemical composition of those rings, in this case, it's strontium and calcium. When we look at that, we can tell when the fish are in fresh water, when they're in the estuary, and when they're in the ocean, because of the composition of the chemicals that were part of those rings that were laid down in the ear. And this type of analysis has allowed us to more accurately understand how fish move into and out of the estuaries and how much time they're spending in fresh water. I would add, from this particular study from Kathleen Nordholm's master's work in 2014, she was able to demonstrate that those juveniles that reared in the estuary and in lowland areas make up a disproportionately large portion of the return spawning population. So they were they comprised less than 30% of the outmigrating smolts, but those fishes were larger and were able to survive better and are a large part of that returning population. They also, another thing that we can understand from analysis of looking at juveniles in freshwater settings versus those that use estuaries is that clearly they're eating different things. So some quite different food and growth opportunities for these fishes over time, depending on where they are. So how does all this that I have told you and chatted with you about so far, how does it respond to what we're here to talk about, which is how resilient might specific salmon be to future climate change? Well, Robin Waples in 2008 set out a series of questions of either Pacific salmon will be able to adapt to climate change, they can tolerate it, they can move, or they can die. So these were the 4 different options that Robin talked about Pacific salmon and climate change. So if we think about that adaptation piece, adaptation requires a genetic change that confers a level of benefit to the individuals such that they are more reproductively successful. And for that change to then benefit more than just that individual, it needs to be passed on to their offspring. And then their offspring need to survive and pass it on to their offspring, and for that to spread through the entire population. So genetic change is linked to a random adaptation that then must, spread through the population. So it can take a very long time for adaptation to spread through an entire population. They can tolerate changing conditions using the existing variation and behavioral adaptations that they already have in response to, in this case for Pacific salmon, thousands of years in and occupying dynamic systems like we have in the Pacific Northwest. They can move. I've already talked about how much they move and how mobile those adults in particular are. And then we all know that they can also just not survive. So these are the options, and we'll revisit this at the end when I talk a little bit about how we're anticipating climate change to affect our coastal systems. So clearly we know that patterns of temperature discharge are changing. So this is from the US Climate Change Research Report from 2014. And this compared temperatures and precipitation, the amount of precipitation between the time period of 1900 to 1960 compared with 1990-ish to about 2012 or so, right? So these two time periods. And in the figure in the upper right, you can see that the areas in the dark red are the places that have warmed the most, moving down into to the blue where things are actually cooler. And you can see that in coastal Oregon and Washington, we have a real mixture of the highest increases in temperature, no decreases in temperature in our area. So climate change clearly is not something that is just going to happen in the future. It's something that's been happening for quite a long time. The same with precipitation. So for the areas of coastal Oregon and Washington, we can see that our change in precipitation has been occurring over this time period. We're getting a bit wetter, right? So some changes in precip here. So that's that freshwater environment, some of the changes we have seen so far and that we're likely to continue to see in the future. Now the ocean. So the ocean is, we have some different climate cycles in the ocean environment. So one is the Pacific decadal oscillation that moves on decadal or multi-decadal time steps of conditions, and that interacts with El Nino and La Nina events, which are more of an annual shade of variability. So when we have an El Nino event, stronger El Nino events are associated with warmer ocean conditions. So we see a loss of some of those coastal winds and upwelling. So those systems, the marine environment is less productive for our salmon during those time periods. And as the marine environment and currents are changing, we're seeing these types of more extreme El Nino or La Nina events occurring. So that's a change that's occurring in the marine environment. And then we have the estuaries. So this is sea level rise. So as I've talked about already, sea level has been rising very, very gradually. After the last ice age, as all those continental glaciers melted, it increased the amount of water in the ocean. We saw rising sea level. But what's dramatic is that, since we started recording observations of sea level with tide gauges, we can see that the rate at which sea level is rising is dramatic and quite different from the rate at which sea level had been occurring in the past. And sea level is a really tricky one for us to get a handle on because there's so much uncertainty, and there's so much uncertainty in the models associated with climate change that it's hard to get a real solid grasp on how much sea level is going to rise in the future. And that's really demonstrated, I think, quite well by this figure that shows all of the different variables that are contributing to what our sea level is in different places. So as ice is melting, as our glaciers are melting, you know, we see those glaciers are so heavy and dense, they actually have their own gravitational attraction. So as the glaciers melt, the gravitational attraction from those glaciers decreases. So in the far north, we start to see sea level dropping. This intersects with isostatic adjustment of the land. As I said, those glaciers are so heavy that when they start to melt and they come off the landscape, the land starts to move up. It starts to rebound. So again, more sea level dropping in the far northern areas. Density changes in the ocean, all that water coming in, that fresh water, more water that is denser and cooler takes up less space, then of course more water that is warmer. So as we have warming happening, the ocean itself takes up more space. Same amount of water, just needs some more space. In our part of the coast, we're responding to uplift and subsidence. So we have a kind of a nick point there at Cape Blanco in kind of mid-southern Oregon, where above that point where the ground is we have this isostatic adjustment, the ground is tipping upwards, and below that point, it's tipping downwards. So there's so many factors that are going into our understanding of what sea level rise is that you end up with projections that look something like this. So this comes from the Committee on Sea Level Rise for California, Oregon, and Washington through the National Research Council from 2012. And you can see that over the shorter time period, so Oregon and Washington are in the blue, we have tighter. So the blue dot is kind of that mean sort of estimate that they have, and then the blue bar represents the variation that sea level could rise as much or as little as between these boundaries. And you can see the farther into the future we get, the bigger that variation is, because again, we don't understand all the factors that go into sea level rise. But regardless of sea level rise, because we have changes in patterns of precipitation and storm events, one thing we know with more certainty that's going to be occurring in our coastal systems are storm surges. So in this figure, sea level rise is the black line that's kind of bumping along in here. We can anticipate it's going to be kind of going up a bit, but you can see that we're anticipating considerably more storm surges, flooding of lower estuaries and coastal communities as we start to see this intersection between intense storm events on the coast with high tides intersecting, causing these storm events to become more common. And of course, beside climate change, there's always the 40% chance of a major earthquake sometime in the next 50 years, thanks to the Cascadia subduction zone really affecting those lowland and estuarine areas on the coast, something that we can anticipate into the future. So what does sea level rise, what might this mean? Well, this is Willanche Creek down in the Coos system. And you can see it at very low tide and then the same system at very high tide. So that very high tide may be normal low tide sometime in the future as we see changes in the amount and distribution of water associated with tides. So we can get an idea in some regards about what our future might be with sea level rise by looking at where the tide is during high flow events. And something that I think is a really important consideration here is that our marshes, when we have intact open marshes to our estuaries, those marshes can act as an important sponge that can hold and contain a huge amount of that storm surge and rainwater that's coming in to our system. So in those places that we have intact marshes, that's a huge benefit for our coastal infrastructure. These are some maps that we've done. This is using LiDAR to look at elevation and then mapping mean high water and mean low water. And so over to the far left where we have that kind of rainbow stripe, that's the spit of the Salmon River Estuary out into the ocean. And then To the right, then that's the Salmon River Estuary. That road that you're seeing there in the lower right is Highway 101, which bisects that upper portion of the Salmon River Estuary. But when we have, would be a typical high water event now without considering adding on sea level rise or a storm surge. But if we bump that up by 0.5 meter, we can see considerably more inundation of those salt marshes that are available to be inundated. And so you can imagine the amount of water that could be contained in these areas. And for our rearing salmonids, being able to access these salt marsh habitats is a considerable benefit for them. And we've seen reemergence of salmon life history into these marshes as soon as they become available to our salmonids. So, and at an even higher level, we see even more inundation of this area and more potential rearing opportunities for our Pacific salmon as well. So in those places where we have access to salt marshes, because the ditches and the dikes have been removed from those places, we see a double benefit. We have that flood control benefit for our coastal communities, and we have a fish habitat benefit as those juveniles can get in and use these habitats and environments. Another thing that's interesting about climate change, and they've been talking about in the northern distribution of Pacific salmon, is that glacial retreat could expand salmon habitat in some places. It was the glacial retreat of the continental glaciers as far south as us that allowed Pacific salmon to start to colonize and use habitats in Oregon and Washington. And we're starting to see the potential for opportunities for more habitats to become available to the north. So there's a variety of changes that we might expect to see for our salmonids, depending on whether you're talking about freshwater, estuary, or marine environments, and whether you're talking about the southern portion of their distribution or the northern portion of their distribution. So getting back to those 4 options that Robin gave us at the beginning, right? Can our salmon adapt to changes? Can they tolerate them? Can they move? Can they die? I don't think we can hang our hat on adaptation. It's random and it takes a really long time. There's a huge amount of variability for them to be able to tolerate change, as long as we allow them capacity to be able to express that variability that they have by allowing them access and connectivity to habitats like estuary environments and floodplains and other habitats. That ability to move is one of the most significant adaptations that our Pacific salmon have to be resilient to disturbance processes on the landscape and in the ocean. They can move and change their distribution. I just talked about more habitat in the north. You might see our Pacific salmon moving north. We'll just have to see. Hopefully they aren't going to just die out. I wanted to point out, as we start to think about enhancing the resilience that's embedded in the behavior and variability of our salmon, that as we think about restoration, as we think about recovery, where we do this work is hugely important as we think about protection. This is from the Coos River system. We mapped the distribution of areas of high intrinsic potential for coho salmon, and then we mapped the types of riparian protections that were in place. And we found that the majority of places that contained high intrinsic potential to support coho salmon are in places that have no legally required protections. So they're occurring in those lower portions of the river system. I don't know that this is news to any of us, but being able to actually map and quantify this was something new. And this is where watershed councils are so critical, because you can bridge that gap throughout the entire system as we start to think about not just one place in the system, but how these fish are using habitats throughout the entire system to be able to target restoration, allowing for that strategic planning through the building of relationships and understanding that really enhances our capacity to have meaningful restoration that is the new frontier, the next frontier, right? Strategic restoration that is placed where we might expect to see changes from sea level rise, from storm surges, from alterations in thermal and precipitation, patterns in freshwater. We can start to identify where those places are. And when we have groups that can allow us access to the entire system, it will make our restoration in the long run more fundamentally effective in allowing our salmon to be able to be resilient in the future. And we know what to do, right? We know some of the things that we can do to enhance and restore habitats. This is from tidal marshes. We know how to remove levees and ditches and dikes and allow for the recovery of these environments for our salmonids. And that's all that I had to share with you today. I would love to have some questions, and I just thank you for this opportunity to be here and chat about some of these ideas. So thank you.
Thank you, Becky.
Yeah, thanks, Becky. That was great.
A lot of clapping, both physically and Zoom-wise here.
Right.
So yeah, everyone get your questions in. Looked like we had a couple come in early. Looked like one early from Paul here. We'll start with, can you speak about the value of beaver in the estuary and further up in the basin for salmon?
So I'm a huge fan of beavers. So beavers are such fundamental engineers of freshwater environments and create habitat diversity and particularly overwintering habitat for many of our salmonids. So, you know, there's quite a bit of work in particular looking at linkages between beaver dams and Coho in particular. So we know that there are some strong benefits for our Coho. You know, I think about our Coho, you know, in the wintertime, they're really small. They've got a lot of time before they become large enough to go out to the ocean, you know, the next spring. So getting through that winter, these small fishes that are not great swimmers, our Coho would not be known as being the best swimmers in a stream environment. So finding these slow pool environments that can provide that protection for them as we see those winter freshets is really critical, and beavers are a key element of that. There's some other restoration work that's being done doing what they're calling beaver dam analogs, so trying to recreate the benefits of a beaver dam without the beavers, since we've done such a good job of eliminating them, and they are still considered a rodent in the state of Oregon that can be removed at will, right? So there's a lot there about beavers. So people trying to imitate what beavers do to stream systems, particularly in floodplain areas where we often have highly channelized systems that are no longer diverse and connected.
Nice, thank you for that. Yeah, it's tempting to describe some of our work plans that utilize some of those concepts, but maybe we'll keep the Q&A going here. Cindy asks, how does warmer water affect sea level rise?
Yeah, so warmer marine water. So if you think about physics, so when atoms are warmer, they move faster, they take up more space. So warmer water inherently takes up more space than colder water does. So and if you think about the ocean, the amount of solar absorption of vast ocean areas, we're worried about heating of streams. Think about heating of the ocean. There's no shade in the ocean, right? So a huge amount of heating can occur there. So that means if there's kind of that more marine water, we're going to have more of that water. It has to go somewhere. It's going to flood, start to flood into our estuaries and inland. And something that I didn't talk about here, but and other folks I know have done quite a bit of work on this, particularly Laura Brophy, but how are salt marshes, where can they migrate? As we start to flood those salt marshes, you're going to start to see transitions due to saltwater inundation over time, likely to see low salt marshes turning into mud flats. Are we going to start to see more marshes moving inland? And a challenge here is that so many because we've been experiencing sea level rise for a long time, we're on a geologically young coastal front that's on the edge of tectonic plates. And so we're already seeing fjorded river mouths. That's what we have in the coast. So there isn't a lot of space inland for our salt marshes to migrate as sea level rises. And that's constrained even further because almost all of our large estuaries have roads around them that really constrain how that water can move upstream.
Yeah, again, tempting to talk about what Midcoast is doing with these landward migration zones, but we'll stay focused. So Fred asks, thoughts on differences between native versus hatchery fish with the ability to adapt or tolerate climate change?
Hatchery fish. Oh, good. So, hatchery fish are, they're controversial. They're controversial for a reason. One of the most important things that we have learned about hatchery fish that have been informative for us to understand adaptation in native fish is how quickly their run timing responded to a management pressure. So our hatchery fish, when our hatchery managers were starting, hatcheries, 60, 70, sometimes 80 years ago, they were interested in getting their brood stock in. So as those fish returned to the hatcheries, they caught and captured and spawned the earliest returning fish because they were just hitting their quota. They just wanted to get as many of those salmon in right away to get that process going. And so they selected, it was a strong management pressure as opposed to an environmental pressure on the return run timing of those salmon. And so over time, we saw differentiation in run timing between wild fish that continued to come over a range of time periods and hatchery fish. So the hatchery run has become shorter. It doesn't have as much variability in timing as we see with wild fish and considerably earlier. There's no negative for those hatchery fish. The wild fish that might return earlier, they're risking that when it's time for those juveniles to emerge into the stream, it's not going to be during a winter storm. Hatchery fish don't have that same natural selection to modify and mediate the return timing of those fish. So we have these two run timings, right, associated with hatchery and wild fish. So when they interbreed, so I guess the point here is we have learned that that run timing, return timing of adults is strongly and very quickly inherited in the population, which also means that if they spawn with wild fish, they're going to pass on that timing. And that timing was adapted to a hatchery use, wasn't adapted to survival in a wild setting. So this is a challenge that we have when hatchery and wild fish interbreed, is that run timing piece is not a benefit. It was a benefit to the hatchery managers. It's not a benefit in the wild. How that intersects with climate change, I think it's a further complication for our wild fish that are already starting to see changes in phenology. So changes in bud burst, think about springtime. We've got differences in thermal regimes and conditions. So making sure that our juveniles are coming out of the gravel when the rains are done and when there's food to eat, that's a real challenge, and seeing variability in the timing of spawning across that range of conditions. Some of them should emerge at the right time, but it can be complicated if we have that additional pressure in terms of the timing of their return associated with hatchery management. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. And I think we see that in some of our systems that don't have active hatcheries anymore. You still get that kind of bimodal distribution in their returns. It's still just a legacy of these hatchery genetics within the population.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yep. And you'll see strays too.
Yep.
Yeah, very thorough answer to that question.
Felt like there was more too.
I'm sure there could be a lot more, but it was some information I'd never heard about that perspective on it. So I appreciate that. Colleen asks, is there a species difference in duration of estuary use? And how can the state better support watershed councils to do more of their great work? What a good question.
It's a good question.
That is the 2-point really good question. I can probably speak better to the first part of it. So yeah, different species of salmon have different dependencies on estuary life rearing. So in that figure that I showed you kind of early on in the presentation, where I had, you know, the amount of time that different species spend in freshwater estuary marine environments, that paper really describes some of the variability that we see in different species of Pacific salmon. Some of them are really just heading out. You know, they aren't spending much time in freshwater or estuaries. They're heading out to sea. You know, and that compares with our Coho and Chinook that can spend quite a bit of time in freshwater. So there's quite a lot of variation across our species of Pacific salmon in the amount of time that they spend in estuaries. The universal truth for our Pacific salmon, though, is that they all have to spawn in freshwater. They can't spawn in salt water. And they all need to go through the estuary, and they physiologically need to change to be able to handle processing saltwater in their kidneys. So the estuaries are important for all of them, but for some more than others in terms of the length of time they need for rearing.
Okay. Can I ask a quick follow-up question related to what you just said, which I hadn't thought of before, but during that kind of smoltification process where they're transitioning, are they more vulnerable to predation during that process, or does that influence their...
Not if there's not a tide gate. So I say that facetiously, but no, I don't. I think they're probably less vulnerable to predation because they're larger fishes. So larger fishes tend to be less vulnerable to some of the predation that you might see in a stream environment compared with smaller ones. But one thing that we've seen, I've done some work with tide gates, and when you have a really nice new functional tide gate, right, it blocks salt water from moving up into freshwater. And so then you have a real difference in salinity, the salinity gradient in a stream. And so you've got all that fresh water above the tide gate, and then you have higher salinity below the tide gate. So when that tide gate's opened and those smolts are heading out into the estuary, they get shocked, right? They haven't had that gradual transition in salinity that has allowed them to physiologically adjust. I mean, the estuary is part of it because the estuary isn't as salty as the marine environment. But, you know, as they're moving through, they get shocked. I don't know, in the estuary that I was in, I would call it the morning or the lunch buffet, because the predators line up on the outs. They know when those tide gates are going to open up, and you can see the birds and the sea lions and the seals all waiting for that gate to open. And for all those freshwater, you know, the salamanders that have gotten stuck in there, the whatever, but a lot of our out migrating smolts, because they get into that system and they just seize up, right? So huge predation risk for them if there's a tide gate.
That's a good point.
So Bill asks, is there any data that points to population increase of salmon to northern cooler environments that may indicate a movement is already taking place?
That is a great question, and I don't know the answer to that question. I'm doing some work in Alaska, and some colleagues of mine are working in Alaska, and we're looking more at a different issue. So populations up there are still very robust. It's still a place where you can go and see, you know, thousands of fish spawning in a stream at a time. You know, it's just incredible up there, those population sizes. But one thing that is concerning, they've got a lot of hatcheries in Alaska as well. They function a bit differently than here. But they're putting so many juveniles into the Bering Sea that we're starting to see shifts in the food web of the Bering Sea because so many hatchery juveniles are feasting at the lowest trophic levels of the Bering Sea. There's concern that you have this intersection then between both higher, but there's issues with acidification in the ocean, which is affecting, this is a long answer, which is affecting how well, shells can form for a lot of our smallest critters on the bottom of the food web, which is a problem. And then you have a huge catch of fish feasting on them as well. So there are different issues in Alaska. So we might see potential habitat up there, but I have some concerns about the marine environment more than the freshwater environment.
Sure. Looks like we lost Trevor. So I'm just looking.
There he is.
I don't know what happened.
Colleen pointed out that smoltification is a great word, and I agree. And okay, I think we'll wrap up with this one. Are hatchery fish eating younger indigenous or native salmon when released in estuary areas?
That's a great question. I don't know. I've never seen, and there may be some other folks on the call here who might know more about that than I do. I haven't heard of necessarily predation by hatchery fish on wild fish. It's usually framed more in a competition challenge. So, our systems can only support a certain amount of fish based on the biomass that we have and the primary and secondary productivity that we have in our streams. And so dumping hatchery fish into the streams is just more competition for our wild fish that are at comparable life stages. So it's more of a competition thing that I've heard rather than an eating of one another sort of scenario. But others may have more information about that.
Sure. All right. Anything else, Trevor?
I have one question to ask, if you don't mind. It's kind of a grade school level, but I feel like this question, maybe you have an answer to. I don't know if like scientists have figured out, or maybe you have like a favorite hypothesis about the homing ability of salmon toward their natal stream. And since we were kind of talking about salmon ecology and anatomy and everything in general, do you have a good understanding of how that process works, that they find their natal streams? And also connected with the conversation here, is that process potentially in jeopardy with climatic changes to ocean conditions and et cetera?
Sure. Yeah. No, great question. So, there's a couple of, I don't think it is, okay. So the current driving thought there is that it's an olfactory sensing of the chemical composition that's associated with very specific places. And so they are able to smell their way back to their natal stream based on the chemistry at the site. And so climate change isn't likely to change that water chemistry component. So the homing potential is likely not going to change, but that's one of the elements. Another piece of really interesting work that David Noakes, the late David Noakes, helped pioneer was how they navigate, and found that they are very responsive to the magnetic fields of the earth that help them navigate and move. Because when they started putting strong magnetic fields around the fish, they moved and navigated differently. So there's a lot of work still to be done, particularly on this topic, but those are a couple of the approaches that have been supported by the literature. It's probably not all of it, but those would be a couple of the bigger ones that I hear about now.
Thank you. Yeah, appreciate that.
I don't think that was a grade school question.
No,
I thought that was a good question. Cool.
How do we get back to the stream?
Great. Well, thank you, Becky. We really appreciate it. A great presentation, and hopefully it doesn't take 6 years to get you back in front of the council and have you back next time.
Yeah.
So
Thank you so much, everybody. Have a great evening.
Great. Thank you.